everyone's time. I want to get started today. First of all, I welcome you to the webinar, but I hope all of you have had a great selling season. I really mean that. I hope that this has been a good one for you, but I think we'll all agree that the competition in the buy here, pay here business has never been greater. And no matter how successful you may have been, I'm sure that you've felt the competitive pressures. Where are those? Where's that competition coming from? Well, Wall Street has, through securitizations, provided low-cost capital in large amounts to finance companies. Franchise dealers are going much deeper in selling new vehicles and certified pre-owned vehicles, and credit unions are also financing the deeper subprime customers. So that all combines to mean that there are more people trying to take your best customers away. But during this webinar, I'm going to show you what some of the most successful operators are doing to compete, and also talk with you about some compliance developments that have affected the buy here, pay here industry during the last couple of months that you might not be familiar with, and how you can protect your own operation from the regulatory onslaught. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I think you're going to find that there's some good information here that will be helpful to you as you navigate the rest of the year. So I want to begin by talking about the auto finance market, and then I want to move in to the deep subprime segment of the market, and I want to show you how much competition there's been for your customers, what has happened in terms of the buy here, pay here operators losing market share, when is that going to change, what does that mean to you as a buy here, pay here operator, and then as we talk about the deep subprime, what are the opportunities there to succeed as the year goes on, and then I'm going to move into some important compliance developments. To illustrate what's going on in the changes in the auto finance market and deep subprime, I'm going to use Experian data today, and I want to thank Experian for their quarterly automotive information that they put out, and by breaking out the deep subprime and buy here, pay here segments so we can actually see the changes of what's going on. So in this first slide, I want to show you the total auto finance market. This the slide, the pie chart on the left is total automotive financings, both new and used, and it shows that the buy here, pay here segment is only about 6.2% of the total auto finance market. However, let me say that the total auto finance receivables have just exceeded $1 trillion. So that'll give you some idea of how big this market is. It's now the third largest credit market, only behind student loans and credit cards. So it's a huge, huge market opportunity out there and growing all the time. The slide on the right showing the year-over-year change shows that the shift that's taken place in the marketplace has largely been to franchise dealers and to banks. They have benefited the most on a year-over-year basis. However, I'm going to talk about how finance companies have affected the market and how credit unions have also affected the market. In order to do that, I think we have to drill down one more layer and separate the auto finance market between new and used, because as we know, the independent buy here, pay here operator does not have virtually any footprint at all in the new vehicle financing market. We're strictly dealing with the used financing market. And if we look at this slide that's on the screen, it tells a little bit different picture, because you can see, although the buy here, pay here segment is down 8.1% in used financings, that represents about 40% of the used financing marketplace. So we've lost about 40% of our market share in the last 2 years. And I'm going to discuss where that transfer has come in. And as you can see from this slide, on a year-over-year basis, finance companies were the biggest recipient, then credit unions were second. And although this is showing a downtick in the captives were extremely aggressive in 2014. And although it slowed a little bit in 2015, we're going to show you that they've been very aggressive in the fourth quarter of 2015. So how big is the market, and what are we really talking about? If we look at the used slides on the right-hand side of this screen, and you add together the green bar along with the purple bar, you'll see that that's about 33% of all used financing. So 1/3 of all the used auto financing is subprime, deep subprime, and regular subprime. So it's a huge marketplace out there. There's a huge opportunity. There's enough business out there for you to be successful and for us to compete successfly if you do it right. And I'm going to show that in just a few minutes. So 1/3 of all used financing today is in the subprime. That's where the action is, because that's where the potential returns are. If we look at this next slide and we focus on the highest risk segment, that would mean customers that are 600 and lower credit scores, which is Experian's definition of subprime. You'll see in the fourth quarter on the slide on the right, this illustrates the change in the fourth quarter, that the captives were extremely aggressive in the fourth quarter of 2015. They were really interested in selling more, more vehicles, particularly certified pre-owned vehicles, and moving year-end inventory out. And the good news is that we saw some slowdown between 2014 by credit unions, and we also saw a downtick from the buy here, pay here guys. And the captives also had the credit unions also had a small downtick, while the banks had an uptick of about 1.5%. So really in the fourth quarter of 2015, it was the franchise operators together with the banks aggressively still financing late model vehicles. But I think the good news is that when we look at our competition, it's very much transaction oriented. They're selling customers with low credit scores, in many cases under 500, new cars or 1 or 2 year old certified pre-owned vehicles, and financing them over periods of 5 to 7 years at payments of $500 a month. I think as an independent operator, you know where that story ends. It ends in the repo bin. And the reality is that that model is not sustainable. And we're already seeing signs in some of the deeper subprime securitizations and with some of the credit union transactions that it's not producing the returns that were anticipated. However, the risk is not retained by the institutions. In a securitization, that risk is being laid off to an investor who thinks the opportunity for yield outweighs the risk. Well, I think we all know that they're going to find out the hard way that risk and reward go hand in hand, and as a result, it's my opinion that the deep subprime customer is going to come back into the buy here, pay here space, and the vehicle will as well come back through auction. We are already seeing some of that at the auction block here as the first quarter has come to an end. The good news as well is that when we look at the used financing market and the deep subprime, if we look on the left-hand side, finance companies and buy here, pay here operators really control that market. Despite the loss in market share that we've experienced over the last 24 months, there's no question that finance companies and buy here, pay here operators still control the market. So we control our own destiny. And it's not necessary to match the aggressive underwriting that we're seeing with some of the competition. It is important that we compete with it, but not necessarily by trying to match the same business models, which I believe are unsustainable. So I want to move now into the fact that some buy here, pay here operators are competing very successfully in the current market. And I want to spend a few minutes on this slide, which I've never shown before. This is out of my Subprime Analytics database, which has over $15 billion worth of analysis. And what I did is I went into my database and looked at what operators and portfolios that I've analyzed had the highest return on investment on a cash basis during 2014 and 2015, because that's how I judge success in the buy here, pay here business, and you should too. Because if you were going to make an investment in anything, you'd want to know what kind of return you're going to get. So if it's not cash, I don't want to hear about it. The reality is I'm not interested in paper profits. I'm interested in cash profits. And this is measuring their performance on a cash basis. Now, I want to caveat that the returns that you're seeing with these top 6 operators are before operating expense, before debt expense, outside debt, and before collection costs. So when you deduct that from the returns that I'm showing on the screen, they're going to be reducing that ROI by some 20 to 25%. But you'll see that even after making those deductions, that a 25% or so return in this environment or in any environment is very, very attractive. So the reality is that it compensates you for the risk that you're taking, but you have to do it right. Now, what I want to focus on is not only the annual return, but the return that can be gained over the life of the portfolio, which is shown in the second column. I want to talk now for just a minute about what these numbers illustrate. The first thing I want to say is that the interest method being used in every case is the simple interest method. It's not pre-computed simple, it's true simple interest, because it's the one way in this industry that you can actually collect more money. When your customer doesn't pay you on time, when you're on the true simple interest method, you're accruing more interest, which presumably you'll be able to collect. So the reality is the simple interest method is one common denominator that we see in the highest return on investment performance transactions. Looking at the next column, the net loss rates, those are loss to liquidation rates, which measure the pace at which losses are occurring in each of their portfolios. Now, the pace is not necessarily the static pool losses, because these pools are not yet fully amortized, as we'll talk about in a minute. But I think the interesting thing is that the lowest loss rates are not necessarily generating the highest returns on investment. So it is important to control your losses, but having the lowest net loss rate is not necessarily the secret to having the highest return on investment. So let's rule out that your net loss rate is going to dictate your return on investment, because that's not true. So some of you are saying, oh, wait a minute now, these people are probably located in a part of the country where they have an advantage over where I am. But take a look at the states that they're located in. I don't see any common denominator there. They're spread out throughout the country. Now, I don't have anybody out in the western part of the United States, but they're spread out through the Midwest, the Northeast, so I think the reality is that this is not driven geographically. So that's not the answer. It's not necessarily where you are located, as long as you have a business model that works within the niche market that you're in. The last column is the percent the portfolio is liquidated. And what we're talking about there is that when we analyze a portfolio, we look to see how far into the performance of the portfolio that the paper has been liquidated. And the key here is that if that percentage is less than 50%, that indicates to us that the operator is originating more paper than the runoff of his portfolio through collections and defaults. So the target should be to keep the percentage liquidated less than 50%, but still do good underwriting. And as you can see, none of these operators have been able to replace the runoff in their portfolio. They're successful with a high return on investment. They're doing good underwriting. They got good business models, but they haven't been able to replace the runoff. That's called competition. And that's where the industry is going to have to focus. Now, this is just an overview of what I'm going to do at NABD 2016. Because at NABD in 2016, in my presentation, I'm going to show you their actual business models. I'm going to show you the ACV. I'm going to show you the markup. I'm going to show you the repayment patterns for every one of these deals. And let me share with you, they're all very similar. Every single one of them has some common attributes, which leads me to believe that despite the fact that there's many different business models in this industry, there's some that are more successful than others. So if you're interested in how your business model shapes up against these, you're going to need to come to NABD and learn what they're doing and compare it against what you're doing. And I will show those business models in detail and leave no questions about what they're doing. In addition, we have just finished up for the 18th year new buy here, pay here benchmarks. These are the most complete, the most accurate benchmarks that we've ever done. We've looked at the policies and procedures. We've looked at exactly how they're generated, and we've laid it all out for you. And along with NCM's contribution and contributions from my old CPA firm, Shilson, Goldberg, and Chung, we're going to give you a bird's eye view of what happened in 2015 and give you the opportunity to compare your own results against these benchmarks. So those two things in themselves should be very helpful to you in assessing how you're going to approach the rest of 2016 and beyond. What I'd like to move to now is compliance. And I'm going to take you through the most recent developments, all of which directly affect buy here, pay here, all of which directly affect you. I'm going to show you exactly what happened, and I'm going to share this information with you so you can avoid it. And I think it's really important that over the next few minutes you learn from the regulatory scrutiny that's being placed on this industry. So let's begin by talking about the CarHop case. CarHop, one of the largest buy here, pay here operators in the industry, was fined $6.4 million for credit reporting violations within their operation. The interesting thing is that the primary mistake that the regulators cited in the CarHop case was the failure to properly differentiate between voluntary and involuntary repossessions. Well, I'll share with you that we never knew previously how important that was going to be. We've never seen that attack before, and surely we've never seen a $6.4 million fine generated from that type of violation. Now, there were some other violations in terms of reporting of repossessions and other things, but we all know how difficult it is to accurately report repossessions in this industry. People redeem, people tell you they're going to redeem and they don't. People tell you they're not going to redeem and they do. There's right to cure laws. It's a moving target. So does it surprise me that we've had some reporting issues? Certainly not. But The reality here is that credit reporting has been put under very close scrutiny, and it generated a $6.4 million fine. And I'd like to point out that of that $6.4 million fine which has been paid, the CFPB retained all $6.4 million, and that any of the consumers that may have been directly affected did not receive any portion of that fine. So all $6.4 million went to the regulatory agency. But I think the point that I want to make here is that some of you are sitting back and saying, aha, I told you, you shouldn't be reporting credit. Then you don't have to worry about it. Don't be too comfortable with that approach, because that could be viewed as being discriminatory. If you're not reporting good credit, or you're not reporting credit at all, or you're being selective, that has consequences as well. So if you don't know the credit reporting regulations, I urge you to learn about them, and I'll talk later about how you can do that at NABD. It's very important that you understand the ins and outs of credit reporting and make sure that you're doing it properly. Markup on finance sales are definitely under attack. I testified in two arbitration cases in December in Ohio, and these are binding arbitration cases which are likely to have a landmark effect on the industry, because we know that there are other similar cases that have popped up around the country. And the argument here is that the regulators, through plaintiffs, are asserting that if your sales price contains a markup greater than the price that NADA retail suggests, that the difference between what you're charging and NADA retail becomes a hidden finance charge. And when that hidden finance charge is added to the finance charges already in the contract, it's a Tyler violation. Your contract is usurious. There's all kinds of state regulatory problems, and basically you have a compliance collapse. And so we made a very strong case why these are not hidden finance charges, and why it's appropriate that the buy here, pay here industry be able to charge prices beyond NADA retail. But you're going to have to stay tuned, because we're waiting for a final ruling in these cases, and we hope to have a final decision and talk about this at NABD. Add-ons. Many of you have add-on products that you're putting into your used financings, and what I urge you to do is make sure that you're disclosing them, that the customer has an option to either accept them or reject them, because if you have 100% penetration, it may be assumed that you're forcing the customers to take this, and if you are forcing them, it can be alleged that that too is a hidden finance charge, because you're requiring them to take that as a condition of the financing. So these are two very important issues that affect the whole nation, and we need to understand what the rules really are. These are not attacks that we've seen before, but they are very serious. I think the buy here, pay here industry has to charge a price greater than NADA retail. I think it's absurd to think that NADA retail is the right price or is a fair price. So we'll talk more about that at NABD, but you're aware that this is under careful scrutiny by the regulators right now through several cases. Another issue is dual pricing, and we have said at NABD for some time that it's all right to negotiate a price when you're selling a vehicle on financing, but it's not right to offer a discount if they pay cash. And Herbie's Auto Sales was tagged with a $700,000 fine for having a different cash price from their finance price. Before we criticize what Herbie's did, understand that the number of cash transactions they had was very small, extremely small. And Herbie's is not the size of CarPop or Drive Time or any of the other large participants. They're a single lot operator in Denver, Colorado. So those of you who think, well, we don't have to worry about that because we're not drive time or we're not car hop or we're not the size of J.D. Byrider, you can think again, because Herbie's is a single lot operator. They just got tagged $700,000. So the reality is, whether you're big or small, you have to be careful about offering a different cash price from a finance price. So you definitely want to take a hard look, if you're doing something like that, how you can avoid having a similar problem to the fines that Herbie's suffered. Now, the FTC is focusing closely on advertising and disclosures. And I think the rule of thumb that we can all use, if you think it's misleading, it probably is. So if you believe that your consumers could possibly be misled by any advertising you're doing, you better not do it. And if you think that you should or shouldn't disclose something, you should err on the side of disclosing it. This is not a good time to hide the facts. This is a time to be clear with your customers and make sure that you give them an opportunity to understand what they're getting into. That's what the regulators are looking for. And the Federal Trade Commission is focusing on it very, very closely. So look at your advertising. Make sure competent counsel has looked at your disclosures to make sure that you're doing things properly. Number 5, customer complaints equal regulatory investigations. Whether you're big, whether you're small, whether you're in between, if you have customer complaints that escalate to the regulators, and there's a hotline that they can call into at the CFPB, you can look for the Attorney General in your state to be sitting in your desk chair, because complaints are directly related to regulatory investigations. And it has nothing to do with whether you have 10 lots, whether you have 5 lots, or whether you have 1 lot. It has to do with whether you're handling your customer complaints. I urge you to put the fire out before it gets above the rooftops. And the reality is, the best defense that you can have against regulatory scrutiny is to resolve customer complaints wherever possible. But wait a minute, we know you can't do that in every case. That's why you need procedures. That's why you need a complaint resolution protocol to show what you do when you have a complaint, to show that you're acting responsibly. The regulators aren't saying you have to resolve everyone. They're just saying you have to act responsibly. So make sure your people are doing that, and don't hide because you think they'll never find you, you're too small, you're located in a rural location where they'll never come and find you. That's not the case. Number 6, the small dealers. Are small dealers exempt from regulatory attack? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, the small dealers are a target because the most aggressive regulatory concerns can be put on the small dealer easier than they can on the bigger operator. The bigger operator can defend themselves, but a small dealer with a limited budget and limited resources is virtually defenseless against a significant regulatory investigation. So the best thing is not to get into one. And the reality is, the way to do that is avoid complaints, have a compliance management system, and try to stay out of the regulatory crosshairs by doing the right things. Learn what to do and make sure you've taken the necessary action. The days where you can do whatever you want because no one's looking are long since gone. We don't know what the regulations are going to be in the future, but we do know what they are now, and we do know what they expect, and so should you. So the reality is, you need to take compliance action now. Recalls. Recalls is a big problem. When I went to Washington last fall, and I've been each of the last 3 years to meet with the regulators, to meet with members of Congress, and participate with other industry leaders, recalls was one of the things that we were lobbying hardest against. And the regulators, in some cases, and Congress, some members of Congress thought that as a used car dealer, you should be responsible for knowing recalls and then fixing them on any vehicles that you have an inventory you sell to your customers. We pointed out that's impossible. The manufacturers don't even have the parts to fix these things, let alone how do they expect you to do it? And how do they expect you to know every recall? So the reality is that our position is we should disclose it to the consumer if we know about it. We should suggest that they take action to repair the recall as soon as those parts are available, but we don't see that that should be the responsibility of the independent operator. But be aware that recalls are a serious problem, not only because of what I just mentioned, but when you're out at the auction and you're purchasing vehicles that may have a recall, it's going to be difficult if you're unable to sell those to resell those again in the secondary market. They have a diminished value, so it's important that you understand what vehicles are subject to recall and how those impact the underlying value of the vehicles. It's important that you understand what disclosures you should make. It's important that you understand how to get a customer to acknowledge that you've made a disclosure to them about it. So we need to stay tuned on recalls. We'll have more discussion on this at NABD, but it's extremely important that you understand the recall situation because it is pervasive within the used car industry. And finally, add-on product penetration is being scrutinized. I touched on this earlier, that if you're requiring the purchase of add-on products when you finance a deal, that can be viewed as a hidden finance charge. If you're not disclosing it, that's going to create problems for you if a customer decides to contest it. I think it's just good business to disclose them fully, to understand which add-on products you should be using, how to fairly price those products, and which ones work the best within your business model. So we're going to have a whole session on add-on products and NABD, including the disclosures and the other regulatory issues. And I think it's important that if you're using add-on products, you understand what the issues are and what to do going forward. So, what can you do to protect your operation? Well, here's 4 or 5 quick things that I'd like to point out. If you don't have a chief compliance officer, you don't have anyone in your operation that's staying on top of the issues and helping your operation get compliant. So you need to get a chief compliance officer. That's where it all starts. And by the way, if you get contacted by a regulator, that's the first thing they're going to ask you is, who's your chief compliance officer? If you don't have one, you're already behind the 8 ball. So get a chief compliance officer. Number 2, put a complaint resolution protocol in place. Teach your people how to deal with complaints. Don't blow them off. Don't take the position that your customer is always wrong. Don't take the position that they're always trying to take advantage of you. Try to deal with people in a fair and honest manner. Treat them like you'd like to be treated themselves. I think that's a good way to approach this. You can't settle every complaint. No one expects you to, but you need to have a procedure to deal with them. You have to scrutinize your documents and make sure that your underwriting and collection procedures are in writing. It doesn't matter how small you are or how big you are, you need written procedures to show what your policies are and to make sure that your people understand what your policies are and that they're following them. This is the time to document your procedures. You need to learn from your competitors' mistakes. Why? Because those are the cheapest ones you can have. A mistake made by your competitor is a lot cheaper than you making it. So why replicate somebody else's mistakes? Why don't you learn from what others did wrong? And the way to do that is through education, networking, participation in shows like NABD or webinars like this one where you keep on top of what's going on. Read the automotive publications. There's a bunch of information out there, but you need to be on top of your game. You need to come to NABD this year because we're going to discuss not only all the things that I've just gone through on a very general basis, but ways to defend yourself. if you get hit with a regulatory investigation, what do? You need to protect yourself. You've worked hard to build up your operation. Don't give it all away to the regulators. Learn how to defend yourself against a regulatory attack and what you need to do to avoid them. Now, NABD's conference this year is at the Wynn, May 24th to May 26th. The title is the same as this webinar, How to Navigate the Road to Buy Here, Pay Here Success. We're back at the Wynn for the 4th year. We have $199 room rates, which is $300 below market. And if that's not enough, there's no resort fee. And they charge a $32 a night resort fee if you're retail. So you'll never stay at the Wynn at these prices in May. You'll never do it. I don't care who you are. So this is your opportunity to come to one of the nation's finest resorts, attend a great conference, enjoy yourself, network with your friends, learn, get great information to take back, and do it economically. In addition to the great room rates, we have early bird discounts, which are expiring soon. So if you sign up on or before April 15th, I believe it is, April 24th, if you sign up before April 24th, you will receive these early bird discounts. You better reserve your room as soon as possible because I can tell you they're going fast. So let's make sure that if your schedule permits, that you get out to NABD this year because it'll be well worth your time. Now, having gone through all of these things, I'd like to entertain some questions. I know I've covered a lot of ground. I know I've shared a lot of things with you. So this is an opportunity to ask any questions that you'd like to over the course of the next few minutes, and I'll try to answer them for you. If I don't know the answer, I'll try to get the answer to you, and I look forward to receiving your questions. So Joe Kearse is here with me, our NABD marketing rep, and Joe, you want to take one of the questions that we've got? Do we have any so far?
Yeah, certainly. We've got a lot of questions coming in right now.
Okay.
And, the first one here we have is, why has the deep subprime market attracted all the competition for our best customers?
Well, that's a great question. I went through the slides to show you how competitive it's become, but really two things have fueled the competition in the deep subprime market. Cheap money, which for the most part is coming out of Wall Street in $100 million, $200 million quantities. This money is being disseminated to finance companies and to credit unions and to others at less than 8%. And in addition to that, greed on behalf of the investor public who can't earn much of a return by making safe investments or keeping their money in the bank. They look at the kind of returns that are possible in the deep subprime auto without necessarily understanding the credit risk that they're getting into. And as a result, that's fueling their appetite. And that's why these securitizations are selling, because by putting in the deep subprime paper, they can amp the yield. And when they stretch it out 7 years, which the independent dealer wouldn't do, it gives the perception of even a bigger return. The reason you as an independent dealer aren't doing it is because you know it doesn't work. But the reality is that Wall Street has been able to sell this time and time again. And that cheap money has to be burnt through, and that's what we've seen in the last 24 months. But the day of reckoning is coming. So the reality is that's greed and cheap money have fueled all this competition, and the deep subprime is where the action is.
Okay. The next question is, Ken, can you define subprime and deep subprime?
Okay, another great question. It used to be that the subprime market was 640 down to 540, and the deep subprime was 540 and below. Well, that's all changed. As credit has declined, as credit scores have declined in the United States, and as the credit market has gotten weaker, they've readjusted the credit scores so that subprime is now defined as 600 to 501. 600 to 501 is subprime, and below 500 and below is deep subprime. Now, it's not fair to say that buy here, pay here is all 500 and below, because we're seeing franchise dealers and others finance customers well below the 500 Beacon score. So the reality is this whole market has shifted, and people, the cheaper money has driven a much more aggressive approach to underwriting lower credit score customers, in many cases the same ones that we have financed in the buy here, pay here space.
Okay, got a lot of questions coming in here. Next question is, does the business model you use really dictate your success?
Well, what I tried to show you on the slide is that the returns of some operators are really exceptional. And I kind of ruled out some of the factors that maybe some people thought drove the higher returns, meaning that it's not always the lowest loss rates, not necessarily where you're geographically located. Those certainly have some impact. I don't deny that, but those aren't the driving factors. I think that your business model dictates your success because it dictates how much risk that you're going to take by how much money you're willing to put on the street. So again, I measure return on a cash basis. How much do you spend and how much do you get back? That's the way I measure return on investment. And that is driven by your business model, because the business model is going to tell you how much you put out and how quickly you get it back. So I'm going to drill down at NABD and show you exactly what factors impact it the most so you can compare it against your own business model.
Okay, the next question is, can you charge interest without reporting credit?
Well, yes, you can charge interest, and of course the finance charges are regulated by the individual state that you're in. Some have caps on the interest rates that you can charge, and therefore the question of whether it's tied to credit reporting is not the case. You have to follow your state regulations, but I really would urge all of you to learn the credit reporting rules. And before you decide not to report credit, or if you are reporting credit, I think you ought to learn what you should be doing. And there's two things that I'd like to mention. Equifax has, and we've released this through a couple of e-blasts, has graciously agreed to have a focus group on Tuesday morning, the 24th of May, right before NABD begins. Now, unfortunately, we can't accommodate everybody, but if you're interested, we'd be happy to have you sign up through a web link. And Joe, I believe you told me that we're going to post a link on our NABD homepage so that people that are interested in attending could put their link in there, and then we're going to try to accommodate the ones that that we can. We won't be able to get everybody, but we're also going to talk about credit reporting at NABD as well. So if you aren't able to attend the focus group, we will be talking about it more at NABD. But I do want to say that I think it's very important before you make a decision on reporting and how you're reporting to make sure that you understand what the rules are. And I urge you to look and make sure that if you are reporting credit, you are separating your voluntary from your involuntary repos. That's usually a software issue. So check with your software provider and make sure that the reporting is being separated properly.
All right, and this next question is about the conference. Ken, I've come to NABD before and I enjoyed it. Will it be the same this year?
That's a great question. I mean, some people think, well, we'll come every so often, you know, and I just want to tell you that this year's show is very different and very important. Number one, for the first time, we have a director of the Federal Trade Commission speaking at the show. And she will show actual examples of where the FTC has had concerns about advertising disclosures and other disclosures or non-disclosures that buy your pay your operators have made. So for one of the first times, we're actually going to be able to see and learn at the same time. That presentation will be extremely informative. Number two is we know that capital is what drives this business. So even if you have capital, you ought to be looking for a backup plan, because the capital markets, as the securitizations don't perform, are going to tighten up. So we've created a capital hour. There's going to be capital as far as the eye can see. It's going to fill the whole Latour ballroom. And if you're selling contracts, if your lines of credit, floor plans, the whole Latour ballroom is going to have different presentation discussion groups where you can go and visit with them. You can talk with them about their program, understand which ones may fit you, so that when you're in the exhibit hall, you can utilize your time most effectively and find the right financing partner. So if you're hunting capital, this is the place to come. If you're not hunting capital, you should be. Technology has never been more important. In the competitive times that we're in, you have to be more efficient, you have to be more profitable, so you've got to implement technology in your business just to compete today. So what is the new technology? We'll have a new product showcase that will show you all the latest technology to help guide you through the exhibit hall and to pinpoint the things that are most beneficial to you. And of course, the compliance issues. I can't emphasize enough the things that I've just talked about are just, an overview of some of the things that you need to do. We're going to have some of the nation's best attorneys drill down and tell you more about how to protect yourself. So I think compliance is another area. And finally, you work hard all of your career to build up a successful buy here, pay here business. And then what do you do with it? Many people just give it away. Or if they don't have a family member to take it over, they sell their notes at a discount and then lease their lot out to somebody else, take a financial loss, and go fishing. Well, there's got to be a better way to doing that. So we're going to have a succession planning panel where some of the best operators, several of our Hall of Famers are going to be on this, talking about how they exited a business. How did they maximize their value? What were the pitfalls they faced? We've never done this before. So succession planning, you need to not only think about today, you need to think about tomorrow. And this will be the first time we've ever done this at NABD. It'll be well worth your time. So those are all new things this year that we've never done before. So if you missed this one, shame on you.
All right, the next question. When do you feel the deep subprime for finance companies will be ending?
Well, I think as we saw from some of these slides that we already in the fourth quarter saw some reduction from the finance companies in terms of their aggressive approach. I think as we see the first quarter data, we're going to continue to see that they've still been aggressive because they're looking to glean on to the tax refunds to stimulate more new business. So I don't think it's going to go away in the first quarter, but I think as 2016 progresses, the losses in some of these securitization portfolios will continue to surface. Will not start to surface, will continue to surface. They're already surfacing. We're already seeing some defaults out there. And as that continues to grow, there'll be more focus on the deep subprime, and things will tighten up. The securitization market will shut down or be tighter. Not all securitizations are bad. There's some that are very successful. People have been doing it for a long time that package them properly, that mitigate some of the risk. They can work out fine, but it's people that have piled on, don't have the experience, don't know how to collect this paper, don't know how to underwrite it, and have been given the opportunity to get to this big securitization bag of cash is where some of the problems are starting to surface. So the answer to your question is no one knows exactly when the turn is going to occur. So what you need to be doing is get financial flexibility to weather the storm. You need to be able to hold it. If you have to sell a car today in order to pay the bills tomorrow, you've got a problem. So you need to get your financial flexibility in order while you get your compliance in order. And those are the two things that you should do for sure while we're waiting for some of the competition to go away. That's the best answer that I think anybody can give you.
All right, we have a lot of great questions coming in. We're going to try and get to all of those. Let's see the next question. Why aren't the old ways working like they used to?
Well, I think what we've seen is two things are really impacting your business right now. Number one is the change in the economics of this business. Years ago, you could buy a vehicle, for $1,500 or $2,000, bring it back from the auction, spray it off, put it on the front line. You get most of that money back in the way of a down payment, so you had very little money at risk. Today, you're putting $5,000 to $6,000 on the street when you sell a vehicle, depending on the business model. Some are even putting more than that. So the risk, economic risk, has increased dramatically. And as a result of that, you have to change your approach to the business. You have to be a better underwriter. You have to be a better collector. You have to have vehicles that can run the term of the contract. You have to treat your customers differently because of the regulatory scrutiny. You have to disclose the cost of operating is increased because of the compliance burden, just because of the competition. So all of those factors combine to change your business. So if you're doing the same old things and expecting a different result, you're going to be sadly mistaken into thinking that's going to produce success for you. So staying at your dealership and doing the same old things is not going to produce the results that you're looking for. You have to open your mind to new ideas. You have to embrace technology. You have to understand the shift in the marketplace. You have to understand the niche that you serve in your business. You have to be on top of your compliance game. You have to be able to source vehicles properly. You have to have the capital to be able to do it. In summary, it takes more skill to be successful in this business than ever before. That skill is obtained by networking, by education, by reading, and by training. And it's just as simple as that. So if you avoid doing those things, then you're going to suffer against the people that are doing those things.
All right. And can you comment on lease or rent-to-own from a compliance standpoint?
Absolutely. Some people believe that the lease here model is utopia because it avoids the regulatory scrutiny that we're seeing in the buy here, pay here industry. That is an absolute fallacy. That is totally wrong. Lease here is under the same scrutiny, the exact same regulatory environment that buy here, pay here is under. Yes, it's a different set of rules. It's Reg M versus Reg Z, but it's still subject to regulatory scrutiny. So if you're thinking you can avoid regulatory problems by shifting to leasing, you're wrong. Now, leasing definitely has some merits in the current environment. And we, again, are disclosing lease here benchmarks in our benchmarks at NABD. So if you're evaluating the leasing model, certainly I encourage you to look at those benchmarks because there are some definite benefits to leasing. But what I would tell you is that if you're thinking about the leasing model, do two things. Number one, understand the regulations that control leasing in your state because they're all different. And secondly, make sure you secured the capital in order to finance your leasing operation. Unless you're going to finance it out of your back pocket, you better make sure that you have a capital provider to be able to finance you or you're not going to be able to grow the business. So those two things are absolutely essential if you're considering the leasing model. Again, I think it has merit, but not in all states, not everywhere, and make sure you've done those two things before you get into it.
All right, next we have, can't you and NIADA get the regulators off our back?
Well, I wish we could. And certainly, I know NIADA is working very hard, and NABD is working closely with them to try to get the regulators to understand the buy here, pay here business. As I've traveled to Washington with other industry leaders the last 3 years, I've really learned a couple of things. Number one, they really don't understand our business. And they really don't understand the importance of what buy here, pay here operators do for transportation in America. So we're certainly trying to do that by talking with them, and I think we're making some headway. And I applaud NIADA for their efforts, and NABD agreed several years ago to work with them in the legislative initiatives because they have the infrastructure to be able to do it at both the state and the federal level, and it takes a combined approach. But what I also think is that as we continue to talk with Congress, as we continue to talk to the regulators and educate them, at the end of the day, it's not going to be what NIADA does. It's not going to be what NABD does. It's not going to be what any of the industry leaders do. It's going to be what you do, because we are going to be judged by the lowest common denominators. So those operators out there that are operating outside the rules, that want to ignore compliance, that want to do whatever they think is in their best interest, not the consumers, are going to be detected, they're going to be fined, and they're going to be put out of business. And unfortunately, as that occurs, all of us are going to be penalized for that. So the best thing that any operator can do is start down the path to compliance and do the right thing, because that will help the whole industry and help them.
All right. Next question. Could you give us a brief synopsis of your argument as to why the markup in excess of NAD retail shouldn't be considered a finance charge?
Well, we're gonna delve into that, and we've got some top attorneys that are going to explain the legal rules. But generally speaking, NADA retail is not intended to be a fair estimate of what a vehicle is really worth. If you look at NADA guidebooks, it disclaims the fact that any individual price is not necessarily intended to mean what that vehicle should really be sold for. It's just an estimate. So number one is that estimate is no better than the next estimate. But number two is that NADA retail doesn't include reconditioning costs, doesn't include add-on products. It doesn't include a lot of the things that are embedded in the buy here, pay here model. It doesn't consider any of those things. And it also fails to consider the sale of the vehicle to a comparable customer in a commercial transaction where the cash and the finance price is the same and the property being sold is identical. So when you put that all under the microscope, as long as you can meet the burdens that I just mentioned, then I believe that if your pricing structure is comparable with what other operators are charging, you have a defense. We have to see whether that defense is going to be accepted by both the regulators and by opposing counsel. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion in the days ahead on that, but that's generally what we think the legal burden is, to be able to satisfy the fact that there's not a hidden finance charge when buy here, pay here prices are in excess of NADA retail. And I might add that my experience is buy here, pay here prices are always in excess of NADA retail, unless it's an exceptional case. So generally, from the benchmarks that I've generated for 18 years, I think we're always going to, be in excess of NADA retail. I think that's, that's a given. So we certainly need to educate the opposition at what I just said.
And I think we've got time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take one or two more, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. How did tax season affect this past few months?
Well, I think we've seen that the tax season refunds are down this year. I think there was just a recent article in Subprime Auto Finance and Tom Webb, I think, cited that the tax refunds are less than they were at the same time last year. Is that a function that they're actually lower? Is it a function that they're just slower in getting there? Is it a function that the IRS is reducing some of these refunds by garnishments and other things for debts that consumers hadn't paid before? Well, the answer is probably all of the above. But I think you're going to hear at NABD from the foremost expert on tax refund business in the United States, Bill Nayland at TaxMax. Bill is going to do a presentation on maximizing your tax refund business. And whenever I have a question about what's happening in the tax refund market, I turn to Bill. So I would encourage you to attend that session if you're really interested, because it's not just what happened, it's what you do about it. It's how you adjust to the change that's taken place in the tax season so that you can capture those refunds going forward. And that's, I know, a part of what Bill's going to talk about as well.
And just before the next question, I want to mention we are getting a lot of questions here about how people can get a copy of the presentation. We are recording this, and we will email participants a link where they can download this presentation.
Yeah, I think we're going to probably post a copy of the presentation on our website, so the link will be on there, and you can go on bhphinfo.com and probably download the audio. We have recorded this session. Hopefully it'll turn out fine.
All right, and next question is, how can we learn more about credit reporting, and what if we are a smaller operator and I don't meet the credit reporting minimums?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, part of the problem that we've seen in the industry is that if you're a smaller operator, some of the credit reporting agencies required a minimum of 500 transactions. So operators would tell me, Ken, we want to report, but we can't because we don't reach the minimum threshold. So working together with NIADA, we were able to get Equifax to lower the minimum if you're an NABD or an NIADA member. So there is no minimum reporting requirement if you're a member of either organization. So no longer do you have to be held away from reporting just because you don't meet a minimum number of transactions. But we want you to understand what the requirements are in reporting. And one of those requirements is you have to have a platform that allows the consumer to dispute whatever you're reporting. Obviously, you have to separate voluntary and involuntary repossessions. And again, I would urge you that if you want to know more about credit reporting, click the link on, on the interest of attending the folks group. Come to NABD. We're going to talk more about it. If you don't get the answers, I'll help you get to the right people to do that.
All right, do we have time for one more question?
One more question, then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Speaking of underwriting, what are some suggestions on best practices for the non-traditional consumer?
Well, I think that today you have to be able to scrutinize and differentiate between people with bad credit and credit criminals, because the market has been diluted so much through all the competition that you're not seeing as many higher quality customers as we used to. So that's all the more reason that you have to be more, you have to differentiate better through your underwriting process. So I would advise people to gather as much information when a customer applies for credit at your dealership, and that you take that information and you use it to match that customer with a vehicle they can afford. There's no sense in setting them up to fail, because they will. They lack financial capacity, so there's enough obstacles to performance anyway. So don't start them down the road to failure. Start them down the road to success. And I think that comes from gathering the right information, running a credit bureau and understanding if what they're telling you is true by validating that, separating underwriting and credit verification by independently having somebody check the customer stipulations that you get, and then looking at their financial ability to pay and their capacity to determine a vehicle that they can afford. So let me summarize that by saying that years ago, one of the best operators in the business told me that they used the cash method of underwriting. And he asked me if I knew what cash was, and I said, I think I do. And he said, no, in an underwriting sense. And what he defined that as is you look at their capacity, you look at their ability to pay, you look at their stability, and then you look at their credit history. And that spells CASH, and that's exactly what it means. So if you have an underwriting program that looks at the cash underwriting model, I think you're on the right track. So Joe, with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining me today. Thank you for your time. Thanks for your great questions. And thanks for what you do for making transportation work in America for millions and millions of Americans. And I'm very proud that the buy here, pay here industry serves a consumer that otherwise would have no transaction. God bless every one of you. I hope that 2016 is a good year. Hope to get to see many of you in the month or so at the WIN for NABD. Hope that this information will be helpful to you. At least you know what's going on out there now, and so you've been forewarned. Now you've got to take the necessary action. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.